the English invaders. I was around 20 years old when things got really bad. I gathered my friends and raised up a band of rebels to resist the English. Quickly, I became the leader of the Scottish Rebellion. I fell in love and was married in 1979. Once my wife helped me and my men escape, the sheriff of Lanark had killed her as punishment. He hoped this would frighten me and make me stop, but this only filled me with rage. I snuck into Lanark at night and killed the sheriff with my sword while he slept. The word spread through Scotland. I became an outlaw, a wanted fugitive being hunted by the English. Where am I? Sorry, I have no clue where I am. Since I was hiding, my men and I planned our attacks from the forest. I said, "Deep in the human heart, the fire of justice burns, a vision of world renewed through radical concern." I led several uprisings against the English during the days of war. But my biggest victory was at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. I did not have a big army, just a small band of regular people from villages and farms. We set up a lookout at a hill that overlooked Stirling Castle and the whole valley. And we saw thousands of heavily armed knights and spearmen and archers around the castle. We had to come up with a plan. Next morning, on September 11th, 1297, the English troops started their way across the bridge. The bridge was only wide enough for 2 men at a time. We waited until their men filled up the bridge, and then we made our move. I commanded my men to charge. We brazenly fought back against the English, who were jumping off the bridge in terror, trying to swim to the other side. The English commander saw his troops being demolished, so he ordered the bridge to be destroyed and sounded the retreat. Because our army was small and outnumbered, we knew we had to be clever to win, and that's just what we did. Thousands of English soldiers were killed that day. I was fearless in the fight. Once I said, "We all end up dead, it's just a question of how and why." After the battle, I was knighted and made Guardian of Scotland. King Edward I struck back with all his might, and a year after this great victory, my army was defeated at the Battle of Falkirk. I escaped with some of my men. Our fight for freedom went on for many years. I led a small band of rebels in many raids and attacks against the English invaders, but they could never catch me. Our raids were successful because of our hit-and-run tactics and the element of surprise against a small group of soldiers. By now, I was basically a guerrilla fighter, and I would never face an organized army again. Since they could not catch me, King Edward I thought of a plan to trap me. I was betrayed and captured and taken to the Tower of London for trial. I was accused of treason. As I was standing there to die, I said I could not be a traitor to Edward, for he was never my king. I was found guilty and hanged, drawn, and quartered in front of a crowd of jeering Englishmen as an example to scare other Scottish rebels into submission. But another hero rose up after my execution, and several years later, Scotland was finally free. I am a hero to Scottish people to this day. I was Scotland's most famous freedom fighter. I grew from a rebel outlaw into an ingenious guerrilla leader. I proved that clever rebels can triumph over an enemy. I once said, "Freedom is best, I tell thee true, of all things to be won. Then never lie within the bond of slavery." Who am I? Yes? Yes. And my centerpiece is a sword and the Scottish flag, and I should have a picture of the bridge, but I don't think it's there.
All right, thank you, Levi. Great job. All right. Next, we have Jack Spencer. His character was born in 1274.
Just tell me when to start. Yeah. I am a hero of Scotland, descended from an ancient Scottish king. I am known for my bravery and for helping win Scotland's first war of independence. I was born July 11th, 1274. My words inspired the people of Scotland to shake off the English yoke. I once said, "We fight not for glory, nor for wealth, nor honor, but only and alone for freedom, which no good man surrenders but with his life." My country had enjoyed nearly 2 centuries of peace and prosperity, but this golden age came to an abrupt end in 1286 when King Alexander III died in a tragic accident, leaving no heirs to his throne. Since Scotland was left without a ruler, King Edward I of England stepped in and tried to take over. He brought his soldiers into Scotland and made the people pay taxes and give their crops to the English. The Scottish citizens refused to surrender to Edward's rule, so he attacked and killed many innocent people, men, women, and children. Sadly, my family sided with England instead of with our countrymen, swearing an oath to King Edward in August of 1296, and we were looked down upon as traitors. By this time, I was in my early 20s, and I was not enjoying the destruction being caused by the English on my country, so I joined the rebellion. Meanwhile, things kept getting worse between the rebellious factions and the English. The fighting continued. But King Edward agreed to a truce with Scotland in 1302, and I fully submitted myself once again to be the English king. Or what? I fully submitted myself once again to the English king. Okay. Okay. There's an automatic stapler and it didn't work out. I married Elizabeth de Burgh that same year, and we would eventually have 3 daughters and 2 sons. My father died in 1304, giving me full control of his lands. On a fateful day in February 1306, I met my long-lasting rival, John Comyn, at Greyfriars Church to sort out our differences. But before we could resolve our conflict, I accused him of having betrayed me, and I struck him with my sword and ran out of the church and took off on his own horse. My men finished the job, and Comyn was dead. I was later excommunicated by the Catholic Church for his murder, but years later I was pardoned by the Pope. In March 1306, I staked my own claim for the throne and for the independence of Scotland. I was crowned King Robert I of Scotland on March 25th, 1306. This made me a bigger target for Edward, who brought his army to fight me. At the Battle of Methven, the first major battle after I was crowned king, we were terribly outnumbered and badly beaten by the enormous English army. I had no choice but to flee, and I rushed to find safety with my most loyal supporters. I lost all my lands and power when I fled, and I had to leave my family behind. My youngest brother sought to protect my wife and children, but they were found and my brother was executed. My wife and children were taken into captivity by the English. I stayed in hiding for the rest of the year, but in 1307 I returned to Scotland and started amassing an army that would allow me to take back my country. Under my leadership, we won two crucial battles, the Battle of Glentrool and the Battle of Loudon Hill in 1307. I had learned many lessons from our previous defeats and used those to our advantage. I was now an experienced commander and would continue to have many victories in various battles. In March 1309, I was holding Parliament in St. Andrews. By the following summer, I was in control of virtually all of northern Scotland. The Scottish Church finally acknowledged my authority as king. I reached out to Edward II in the fall of 1310, offering a truce, but he rejected my offer. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, we decimated Edward's army of 20,000 men, and even the king barely made it out alive. After this, I rescued my wife and children and captured many castles and territories that had been taken by the English. Scotland was now free from English control, but Edward never stopped fighting for control. Eventually, he died, and in 1328, his son, Edward III, signed a treaty that ended the fighting once and for all, finally recognizing Scotland as a free and sovereign land and acknowledging me as its rightful king. This ended the First Scottish War of Independence, which had lasted for 32 years. The battle had been long fought and hard won, but we had finally achieved our freedom. I enjoyed this peace for about a year before I died in 1329. I was a founding father of Scotland. I was a freedom fighter who drove the English out of my country, winning our independence. Who am I? I don't know. You back there. Yeah.
Very nice. Thank you, Jack.
My centerpiece, I had a couple of them. One was like my flag and the Scottish flag and a crown.
Thank you so much, Jack. Great job. Okay, next we have Lydia Ellis, and her character was born in 1510.
Remaining faithful. What would you do if your faith was constantly under attack? During the age of absolute monarchs, kings and queens of European countries ruled not only politically, but also religiously. While the early 1500s ushered in the Reformation, tensions escalated between Protestants and Catholics and bubbled over into European governance. I was born into this tumultuous time and was brought up in a Protestant household in France. After marrying a duke, I moved to a province in Italy and welcomed Protestant refugees to my home. When my husband died, I was banished to France because of my faith, but I continued to serve suffering Protestants who were fleeing from persecution. Despite the onslaught of ongoing attacks against my faith, I remained faithful to God. Born in Blois, France in 1510, I lived an uneventful life until my parents' deaths, but their deaths acted as a springboard for my faith. After the death of my mother, I lived with my aunt and my sister for many years and served God faithfully. Because my parents died when I was a small girl, my aunt enlisted the help of a governess named Madame de Soubise to help raise me. Madame de Soubise, a devout Christian, came from England with a Bible hidden in her luggage and showed me the sweet sacred truths of my Savior. Certainly, my faith fully formed under the care of these three kind and influential women. I never abandoned their teachings. However, when I was 18, I unwillingly married Hercule d'Este, who was the Duke of Ferrara, a province in northern Italy. d'Este scorned my Protestant faith, and I lived in constant loneliness in my new home. Still, I never forgot my faith and leaned on the Christian teachings from my early years. After beginning my married life and moving to Ferrara, I saw the persecution of fellow Protestants and offered refuge for reformers. I used my large home to house refugees who were fleeing from religious persecution in France. Many French Protestants, who were called Huguenots, were welcomed to my house. John Calvin was among these. Because my activities infuriated my husband, he hastily sent inquisitors, who followed me wherever I went, mercilessly threatening to hurt me unless I agreed to deny my faith. Finally, exhausted and in tears, I agreed to recant. To make sure I was telling the truth, my husband secretly sent for spies, who watched me continually. Outwardly, I conformed, but secretly I kept up my correspondence with Protestant leaders and continued to send money to foreign missions. While my court certainly was a safe haven for Reformed Protestants, I myself faced hardship for my Reformed faith. Before my death, I lived in France for many years and served God faithfully. After my husband died, my son became Duke of Ferrara. Because he hated Huguenots even more than my husband had, he told me that if I didn't give up my Protestant faith completely, I would be banished to France. I bravely chose banishment. I was exiled to France, but my hardships continued. Unfortunately, at this time, France was in the midst of religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, and during the Third Religious War from 1568 to 1570, the castle which I lived in was besieged. Still, I welcomed hundreds of Protestant refugees to my home during my time in France. I certainly used my bravery to serve God and other people in many ways. During my early life, I was influenced by several women who kindly encouraged my Christian faith. Upon marrying my husband, I faced frequent hardship in my own home, but I still offered a haven to those who were fleeing from religious persecution. Eventually, I was banished to France, but I still continued to welcome Protestant refugees to my home. Standing firm amid adversity, I encouraged other believers to endure. While my overall life revealed my steadfastness to my Savior, it also revealed the costliness of caring for other Christians. I put others before myself. Because of my courage, I encouraged other believers to remain faithful in hardship. Who am I? Renee of France. And my centerpiece is Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion and a crown.
Thank you, Lydia. And next, we have another Lydia. We have Lydia Embry. Her character was born in 1533.
The Queen Who Changed the World. In life, things don't always work out the way you expect them to. Such was my life. My birth should have been one of the happiest moments of my mother's life, but joy quickly changed to tragedy, as my mother's head was chopped off soon after, because I was a girl and not a boy. Sadly, instead of having a father who loved us, took care of us, and protected us, he favored my brother over my sister and me. He put me under house arrest as a kid and destroyed the very fabric of our family repeatedly. However, when I was older, despite being third in line for becoming queen, God had decided that I would become one of the greatest English monarchs ever to live. Although the time as queen was filled with many dangers and toils, like almost being killed by my cousin, God saw me through the 45 years I reigned and provided many great accomplishments. To understand who I am and why my reign was so important, I must tell you about my difficult childhood. My father, whose name was King Henry VIII, was the second Tudor king of England. For my father's kingly line to continue, he needed a male heir. But his wife, Catherine of Aragon, could not provide one right away. Instead, she gave birth to his first daughter, Mary. With no other options available, he had to divorce her. Because England was part of the Catholic Church in order for him to divorce her, my father had to ask the Pope to annul his marriage with Catherine. When the Pope refused to do so, Father broke away from the Catholic Church and declared that he would now be the supreme head of the Catholic Church. After my dad divorced Catherine, he married Anne Boleyn, who was my mother. Sadly, their marriage did not last a happily ever after, as my mother also failed to provide him a son, but another daughter, me. So he executed her and remarried soon after. This time he married a woman named Jane Seymour. Finally, my father got what he wanted when a son was born to them, my adorable little brother Edward. Tragically, though, this resulted with his wife dying because of childbirth. This presented a problem for father because he needed more than one son to ensure the continuation of his kingly line. Therefore, father continued to marry more women. He married 6 women altogether. It was his 6th wife, Catherine Parr, that helped me the most, as she got me out of exile that my father put me in many years ago so I would never become princess. Despite my father's attempts to control my future, God used that time to prepare me to rule England successfully for 45 years. I would now like to tell you the story of how I became Queen of England. Tragically, Father died in the year 1547, when I was 13 years old. 9-year-old Edward became King Edward VI, who continued Father's anti-Catholic reforms. Everything was seemingly fine, but then Edward died, and things quickly went downhill from there. My sister, Mary, became queen, and she was a Catholic. She tried so hard to convert England back to Catholicism, which was a problem for many who weren't Catholic, including me. I was a Protestant, and because Father had divorced her mother to marry mine, Mary hated me. Not only that, there was a revolt in England because of Mary's persecution of the Protestants, and Mary suspected that I was involved. Consequently, she imprisoned me in the Tower of London when I was just 20 years old. As Mary burned Protestants at the stake, she earned the nickname Bloody Mary. Another thing that angered the English was that she married Philip the Catholic King of Spain. When Mary was unable to find any evidence connecting me to the revolt, I was finally released from the Tower of London and put under house arrest in a country manor. In November of 1558, Mary died. When the messenger came to tell me that I was the new queen, he found me under a tree reading a Greek Bible. I was so overjoyed to be free from her oppression that I sang the words of Psalm 118 from memory. God had rescued me. As queen, I did many things differently than Mary. Mary had an extensive Catholic privy council, or her royal advisors, while I had a much smaller privy council of 19 members, who were all Protestant. Also, Bibles and church services were now in English rather than Latin. As its queen, then, I strove to change England for the better, while Mary's reign tore the country asunder. As the Queen of England, there were many troubles to overcome. One of my first problems was the crisis between the Catholics and Protestants. There was much animosity between the two groups as a result of Queen Mary's persecution. I felt it would be better for the country if it were Protestant, because the majority of Englishmen were Protestant. Not surprisingly, though, this greatly angered the Pope. Pope Pius V defiantly declared that if a Catholic assassinated me, it would not be a sin. Incredibly, someone actually tried to do this. My cousin Mary Stuart, or Mary Queen of Scots, fled to England because her own country was in political turmoil. This was another problem to overcome because since she was my cousin and a Catholic, many believed she had an equal claim to the throne as I did. Not knowing what to do with her then, I imprisoned her in one of my castles. In 1586, however, Mary's fate was sealed. When I found letters written by Mary and a man named Anthony Babington plotting to murder me and rescue Mary, I decided Mary must be executed for all her scheming. Another problem I had to overcome as queen was the question of marriage. Although I had many suitors and Parliament wanted to marry, I didn't want to. I knew it would limit my power as queen, so I held my coronation ring and declared, I am already bound to a husband, which is the kingdom of England. Another problem although I reserved that problem, more trouble was brewing on the horizon. The execution of my cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, caused Philip, the King of Spain, my sister Mary's brother, to attack England with an armada of 130 warships. I had a strategy, though, as I sent 8 ships engulfed in fire straight into the Spanish armada. The inflamed ships inflicted detrimental damage to the Spanish fleet and smote their ruin. We had won. On March 1603, after a long and successful reign, I died. James I of England was my successor, although he was the son of my late cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Through my reign, there were many troubles that I overcame. I did my absolute best to rule England, and in the end, England was stronger than ever. I had an incredibly difficult family and a tragic childhood, but God, who was good to me, brought me through it and taught me never to give up. Through an unusual turn of events, I found myself Queen of the Great England, although I was third in line to the throne. While I was queen, many troubles arose, so I worked hard to find the best solutions. I had done it. I ruled England as one of its most powerful female monarchs because I never gave up and God never left my side. I was England's beloved ruler, Gloriana. Amazingly, one of my favorite knights named the British colony Virginia, which is now a state in the United States after me, the Virgin Queen. I helped change the world forever. Who am I? Yeah.
Thank you. Can you tell us what your centerpiece is, please?
What?
Your centerpiece, please.
My centerpiece was the Lego worship battle back there.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Next, we have my son, Nathaniel Lohman. His character was born in 1599.
Pursuit of tolerance. While addressing Parliament, I once stated, I desire not to keep my place in this government an hour longer than I may preserve England and its just rights, and may protect the people of God and its just liberty. Throughout my youth, my leadership in the bloody English Civil War and my establishment of the first Commonwealth in England, I pursued freedom of religion for the English people. I was born in Huntington, England on April 25th, 1599, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. My parents, Robert and Elizabeth, were outstanding Puritan farmers. In my youth, I enjoyed spending much of my time playing football. I attended Cambridge University for only 1 year when my father died in 1617. I was forced to leave school and return home to run the family farm. 10 years later, I was elected into Parliament, which is when my career began. King Charles was crowned in 1625. During the first 10 years of his reign, he grew corrupt in his power. Religious tensions continued to increase, and there became a great divide in Parliament. Catholics versus Protestants. King Charles sided with the Catholics. I sided with the Protestants. In 1642, civil war erupted in England. Although I was not a trained soldier, I was an excellent horseman, and I became a brave leader in the second command. In 1644, I led a newly created army into battle, and we were victorious over the king's army. 2 years later, King Charles fled and was later captured. After a lengthy trial, he was executed in 1649. Britain became a republic for the first time in history, and I became its Lord Protector. As I began to rule England, I found that Parliament was extremely corrupt. Therefore, I dismantled it. Since I hoped England would remain, Since I hoped for a more religious freedom and a fairer form of government, I created 2 new parliaments. England became a commonwealth when a new constitution was written that brought about change. After a 200-year ban on the Jewish religion, I allowed the exiled Jews to return to England. In order to keep to the simple Puritan way of life, fancy Christmas celebrations, theater plays, and public dancing were banned. Drunkenness and swearing were made punishable by death. In 1657, Parliament requested to crown me as their king. However, I refused. I hoped England would remain a commonwealth. I ruled England for only 5 years before I became sick with malaria and died on September 3rd, 1658. A grand funeral was held for me at Westminster Abbey, lasting 7 hours. Under my reign, Great Britain was a commonwealth for the first time in history. However, when I died, it returned to a monarchy. 2 years after my death, I was dishonored as a traitor. My body was exhumed and my severed head was placed on a 20-foot spike where it hung outside of Westminster Abbey for almost 20 years. Throughout my youth, my leadership in the English Civil War, my establishment of the first Commonwealth in England, my life's pursuit was to become a man who promoted the goodness of God's love throughout religious tolerance in England. Who am I? Yes. Yes. My centerpiece was the pineapple because I was the first one to eat a pineapple, and a cross with the Bible, and I was the first one to eat a pineapple in England, and a horse.
Very nice. Thank you, Nathaniel. Okay, next we have Noah Hankey. His character was born in 1805. We skip ahead about 200 years.
A man of faith. Matthew 21:22 says, "And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith." I did not have faith in my early days. I was a dishonest kid, but my life was transformed by God's amazing grace. God called me to be the protector of Bristol's orphans. Because of my faith, God provided for them. He changed my life from a thief to a man of faith. God miraculously changed my life. I was born on September 27th, 1805, in Kroppented, Prussia. My dad, who was a tax collector for the Prussian government, taught me how to handle money, but I stole money from my dad and lied. When I was 14 years old, my mother died, but I was not moved and did not change my sinful ways. I left home as soon as possible and fell into an ungodly company. When I was 16 years old, I was apprehended and thrown into prison for dishonesty. Angrily, I stayed there for 5 weeks. My furious father finally bailed me out and sent me to the University of Hale. I studied in the mornings and stumbled back from the pubs late at night. A few months later, I traveled to Switzerland, but during the trip, I cheated my friends out of their hard-earned cash. Later, a friend named Betta invited me to a Christian meeting at the house of Herr Wagner. That is where I met Jesus. After that day, I never hung out with my terrible friends again. I felt called to become a missionary, but my dad wanted me to become a Lutheran pastor. My dad was very irritated. I traveled to a missionary school in London to preach to the Jews. However, I only stayed there for about 5 months because I realized there were hundreds of other street kids who needed Jesus, food, and a home. In 1830, on New Year's Day, I quit being a missionary to the Jews so I could pursue God's calling. He changed my life. God called me to take care of the poor orphans in England. When I was 25 years old, I married Mary Groves. When I pastored Ebenezer Chapel in Tingmouth, I gave up my yearly salary of 55 pounds and wholeheartedly trusted in the Lord for money. Eventually, we moved to Bristol, where there were thousands of needy children, and there I helped my friend Henry pastor Gideon Chapel. Cholera, which had fatally struck the city, had left thousands of children hungry, helpless, and homeless. When I opened a breakfast club and a day school for orphans, I realized they needed a home. I felt called from God to open an orphanage. 2 months later, on February 3rd, 1836, I opened an orphanage, but surprisingly, no street children arrived. I was dejected. Surprisingly, I then realized that the one thing I forgot to pray for was the orphans. The next day, the orphans flocked in. In the following years, I opened 3 more orphanages. I was caring for 126 orphans, and there were thousands more in need. God called me to take care of Bristol's orphans. God provided for the needy orphans in response to my prayers. He miraculously provided a 7-acre parcel of land called Ashley Downs. I constructed an orphanage on that land that could house up to 300 orphans. On June 18, 1849, a long line of orphans began marching up the hill to Ashley Downs. Over the span of 21 years, I erected 4 more orphanages on the property. The 5 structures housed 2,500 children. I educated, fed, and clothed over 10,050 orphans in my lifetime. One day there was no food and it was time for breakfast. I walked up to the enormous table and prayed, "Dear God, we thank you for what you are going to give us to eat. Amen." After the prayer, we heard a knock at the door, and the baker walked in and told, "I was up all night baking bread because I felt that I should make it for your orphans." While they were eating the warm bread, they heard another knock at the door, and the milkman walked in and stated, "My cart broke down right in front of your house, right in front of your orphanage, and I will need to lighten the load to fix it. Would you like to have the milk?" This is just one example of the many ways God provided for the orphans in response to my prayers. I was a miserable thief who was transformed by God's amazing grace. When I was a young man, I was called by God to take care of orphans. Because of my prayers, God miraculously provided. Through my prayers, God changed over 10,000 lives. Although I never had a salary, over £1.5 million passed through my hands, which is about $120 million in today's money. I trusted in God, and my prayers were powerful. I was truly a man of faith. Who am I? You. Yeah. Yes. And my centerpiece is the bread and milk over there. All right.
Thank you, Noah. Next, we have Allison Colvin, and her character was born in 1819.
The unlikely queen. The king is dead. I am not queen. My era has just begun. I am the queen who is never meant to be. Born on April 24th, 1819, I was 6th in line to the English throne. During my childhood, I had little opportunity to make friends with my peers. Instead, I was expected to spend time studying, meet elite members of society, and even had to share a room with my mom. My father had massive dreams for me and explained to others, "Look at her well, for she will be Queen of England." After the death of my father and all his brothers, just after my 18th birthday, my father's vision came true. Early in the morning of June 20th, 1837, I became Queen of England. While my coronation day was an important event in my life, my happiest days were spent with my husband, Albert, who is a prince of Germany. I may have been the queen of the greatest empire this world has ever seen, but it was only with the support and direction of my Albert that our era impacted the world the way it did. Soon after our dreamy wedding day, our first princess made us parents, and the 8 other children really sealed the family line. With my devoted Albert by our side, was known for its virtuous principles. Albert's drive to bring progressive innovations to our kingdom led to great developments during the Industrial Revolution. Many years after my husband's death, one of our greatest achievements came later in life. Without ever stepping a foot into the country of India, I successfully acquired the title Empress of India. I learned to love the culture and the people of the land. My reign was the longest of any monarch before me. Now second to my great-great-granddaughter Elizabeth II, I may have been the unlikely queen who was never meant to be, but my era helped usher the world we know today. Who am I? Yes, I am Queen Victoria. My era, known as Victorian era, brought about many inventions and was the largest kingdom to have ever existed. And my centerpiece is the tea, English tea and the Indian stuff with. Cool.
I'm going to use this microphone. This one's not working. Next, we have Stella Hankey. Her character was born in 1820.
A life of service. Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. Proverbs 19:17. I was devoted to nursing the poor and was rewarded for my service. I was born May 12, 1820, in Florence, Italy, on my parents' extremely long honeymoon trip. After we returned to Lea Hurst, our enormous, dazzling mansion in Derbyshire, England. From the time I was a young girl playing with my dolls to my time as a nurse at the Crimean War, I was always ready to do God's marvelous will. I was a young girl who loved playing nurse with my beautiful dolls. Sometimes I pretended that they had the whooping cough and put all 13 dolls in their miniature beds. I put tiny cool washcloths on their white china heads and nursed them until I decided they were better. But they were well only a few days before I immediately put them to bed again with a new illness. My elder sister Parthenope liked to go to fancy balls, while I preferred to help the poor and the sick. My mother would often find me around dinner time in a humble cottage, nursing the sick and bringing food for the poor. When I was 16 years old, I felt God call me to be a nurse. Not long after, I went to a hospital and received excellent training in nursing so that I would be proficient and properly prepared for everything God had planned for my life. Boldly, I put aside a life of riches to obey my calling from God. Although I was offered 2 proposals of marriage, I realized that if I married, I would be saying no to God's purpose for my life. When I turned 30, which was the age when Christ began his mission, I wrote these words in my journal. No more childish things, no more vain things, no more love, no more marriage. O Lord, thy will, thy will. In 1853, I finished my training to become a nurse. I rejected marriage in order to go to hospitals and nurse the sick, a job few would lower themselves to do. Because of God's calling on my life, I agreed to serve in the Crimean War. In March of 1854, Britain and France joined Turkey and its allies and declared war on Russia. As the Crimean War raged on, there weren't enough doctors and no nurses at all. The soldiers who were injured on the Crimean Peninsula were desperate. When I was asked to travel to Scutari and oversee the Barrack Hospital, I resolutely agreed and brought 39 properly trained nurses with me. The hospital was overflowing with thousands of wounded and sick men. I was horrified at what I saw. There were lice swarming the beds, rats and mice infested each room. The men were given only soup made with spoiled meat once a day, and they were only bathed every 98 days and had only one scrub brush that they used repeatedly to wash each man. But I changed that. I gave orders, wash everything in sight. I also bought 300 scrub brushes and 100 bathtubs. I got women in England to strip their bed sheets to make bandages for the men. Each night, I would make my rounds of the hospital with my lamp in hand to light up the dark rows of beds of the hospital with either writing down a man's final words to give to his family or standing next to the bed while he was being stitched up. I was always there when needed. I worked wholeheartedly in the hospital until I tragically fell ill with the Crimean fever and was forced to stay in bed. But that did not keep me from staying busy. I wrote many books and erected a place where women could be trained to become nurses. Queen Victoria honored me with the beautiful jewel because of my service in the war. On August 13th, 1910, when I was 90 years old, I breathed my last and received my heavenly reward because I obeyed God's call. As a child, I devotedly nursed my dolls. As a young lady, I staunchly rejected marriage in order to be trained in hospitals. And as a woman, I wholeheartedly answered my call to serve the wounded in the Crimean War. I spoke these following famous words while looking back on my life. If I could give you information of my life, it would be to show you how a woman of very ordinary ability has been led by God in strange and unaccustomed paths to do in His service what He has done in her. And if I could tell you all, you would see how God has done all and I nothing. I have worked hard, very hard, that is all, and I have never refused God anything. I put aside a wealthy life so that I could say yes to a life of service, the life that God had called me to. Who am I? Yeah. Yes, I'm Florence Nightingale, and my centerpiece is the lamp with the Bible.
Thank you. Okay, next. Next, we have Jessalyn Brenneman, and her character was born in 1892.
Love is larger. Is your faith strong enough to overcome evil? My life was spent answering this very question. Although I relished a peaceful childhood, I would be tested more than I ever imagined possible. Born on April 15, 1892, my parents were Casper and Cornelia. I had one brother and two sisters. Every morning we gathered for family devotions, where we prayed earnestly and read God's word. My papa was the finest watchmaker in our city of Harlem, and because I followed his example, I became the first woman licensed as a watchmaker in Holland. At that time, all of Europe was afraid of a Nazi invasion. One night, our fears came true when the Nazis started bombing our peaceful little city of Harlem. I could not sleep that night because of all the noise, so I got up out of bed and went downstairs for a cup of tea with my sister. Later that night, when I climbed up to bed, I cried out in alarm, because lying there on my pillow, where I had been on an hour before, lay a piece of shrapnel. My sister, having heard my cry of distress, came up beside me. She gripped my arm and said, "God must have saved you for a reason." Was she right? Since I was part of the underground, my family secretly hid Jews in our house, which was incredibly dangerous. We decided that we needed a secure room for these Jews to hide in. Suddenly, I found my room under construction. At last, we had a secret room. One day, I was taking a walk and witnessed a Jewish family being mistreated and thrown out of their home. As I watched, I prayed, Lord Jesus, I give myself for the Jewish people in any way, any place, any time. I didn't know it then, but my peaceful life was coming to an end. Would I be able to follow Jesus and survive the darkest evil I would ever be able to imagine? In my increasingly dark world, I struggled to see God's light. On February 28, 1944, the brutal Nazi soldiers arrested my family. We were packed like cattle onto a baggage car and sent to a concentration camp where thousands of his prisoners were held. Later, I was moved to Ravensbrück, which was one of Hitler's notorious concentration camps where thousands of prisoners were held. I decided that if there were a hell on earth, this would be it. Prisoners were treated like animals, forced to march naked and work in temperatures below freezing. The merciless guards abused us continuously, and rats, lice, and fleas infested our bunks. Joy was absent. Incredibly, we learned to give thanks even for the lice, because they kept the guards away so we could hold Bible studies. My sister and I shared God's love by tending to the sick, watching young children while their mothers slept, and even celebrating birthdays in the revolting place. Suffering from tuberculosis, my sister perished in the awful place. After 10 agonizing months, I was miraculously released, although I was weak, sick, and frail. God's light did shine, even in Ravensbrück. As my sister said, there is no pit so deep where God is not deeper still. Now free, I devoted my life to loving God and sharing his love. Healing slowly came. Out of my family, only I survived the war. I found it hard to find joy after the tragic war ended because I had seen and lived through such hardships. Anxiously, I found myself asking the Lord, "Do you still have work for me?" Soon after, I got my answer. Trusting the Lord, I opened a home in Holland for victims of war. As part of my work, I traveled around the world and spoke about my experiences so that I could help others learn about God's majestic love. After one of my speeches, as I was meeting attendees, a man extended his hand and spoke. I froze. I stood aghast and transfixed, my arms glued to my side. A flashback raced through my mind, and I recalled that this man had mocked me when he was a guard at Ravensbrück. I, who had just spoken about forgiveness, had a choice to make. Could I forgive him? I prayed, "Oh God, help me to live my message." God answered my prayer, and I extended my hand in true forgiveness. On April 15th, 1992, on my 91st birthday, I passed away after suffering my third stroke. After my death, I was honored for my courage, my efforts to helping the Jews, and for sharing God's love. God's love and faithfulness carried me throughout my childhood prior to World War II, during my time in the darkest pit of concentration camps, and afterwards as I found healing and forgiveness. I believe love is larger than the walls which shut it in. Who am I? Yes. My centerpiece is a yellow star, a Bible, and a clock.
Thank you, Jesslyn. Okay. Last but not least, we have Miss Ella Embry. Her character was born in 1926.
I think that's small enough.
Serve the people. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and my life. I love horses and dogs, especially corgis. I have a great sense of humor and love a good joke. I can fix an engine with the best of them, and I am England's longest reigning monarch. I have a wonderful family and an amazing childhood that was happy and carefree. I was born April 21st, 1926, and my grandfather, George Windsor, was King of England. I have a younger sister named Margaret. We played together for hours at a time with our many toys and went on outings with our nanny. Later, we were taught a variety of subjects at home by our governess. My family and I were very close, and my father called us, our little family, us four. We enjoyed playing games together and having tea as a family. every afternoon like any other family. This was my favorite. I was not in line for the throne because my grandfather had 2 sons and my father was the younger. He was the Duke of York. Unfortunately, when I was 10 years old, my grandfather died and my uncle became King Edward VIII. In that time, it was not acceptable for the king to marry a divorced woman. But Uncle David was desperately in love with an American woman who had been divorced twice. Consequently, my Uncle David abdicated the throne, and my father took on the responsibility of being king instead. Literally overnight, I was next in line for the throne. Although it was unexpected, because of my wonderful childhood, I was prepared for it. My life changed drastically. My family and I were moved to Buckingham Palace, and there were many new challenges in my life due to being in line for the throne. I had to prepare to be queen, to being the queen by studying the laws of the country. Also, now even my closest friends had to call me ma'am. It was so uncomfortable. 3 years later, something awful happened. World War II began, and Buckingham Palace, my home, was bombed 9 times. Hastily, Margaret and I were moved to Windsor Castle, another palace outside of London, to keep us safe. Windsor Castle still feels like my true home. My parents, as the King and Queen of England, had to stay in London in order to serve and protect the rest of the country, so I would only see them on weekends. My parents during weekends. Desperately, I wanted to join the war effort, desiring to serve my country, but my father would not allow me to go into the war. Instead, I collected tin foil, rolled bandages, and knitted socks, which was my least favorite. When I was 19 years old, my parents finally allowed me to be more involved. I became a mechanic and a fast, proficient driver. Then, in November of 1947, at 21 years old, I married popular Prince Philip of Greece. During the next 3 years, we had 2 children, Charles and Anne. When I was 26 years old, unexpectedly, my father died while I was away on a trip. We were all devastated at his loss and mourned for him for a year, and then I was queen at 27 years old. During my coronation, I made an oath to rule justly before God. Oil was poured on my head, and I was given the crown jewels, including an orb, a ring, a crown, 2 scepters, and the Bible, the foundation of my life and my reign. Because of this, my life was changed forever. As queen, my family was significantly impacted by my new position. Normally, my work days began at 9 a.m. by reading my big red box of British government. In this box are all the government papers that I must read and sign. Papers to document what is going on in the Parliament, as well as any messages from the Commonwealth leaders. Also, my private secretary helps me to stay informed by bringing my mail and daily newspapers to me. I have a weekly meeting with the prime ministers, my first being the great Winston Churchill. During my reign, I worked with 13 prime ministers, visited all 50 countries of the Commonwealth, and met many people, including 13 American presidents, many actors and actresses, a number of athletes, and countless pop stars. From around the world. While my children were young, Prince Philip took most of the responsibilities for them because I was very busy with royal duties. He was a devoted father who spent a lot of time with our 4 children, Charles, Anne, Edward, and Andrew and Edward. He made all the decisions concerning them. Although sometimes the children were unhappy with his decisions, I did not interfere with what he had chosen for them. Being the queen not only affected my life, but impacted my husband and children in countless ways. Throughout the 3 years of my reign, one thing remained constant through good times and bad times. I gave a speech Christmas Day at 3 p.m. every year. My first Christmas Day speech was in 1952, where I asked the Britons everywhere to pray for me that God may give me wisdom and strength to carry out the solemn promises that I shall be making, and that I may faithfully serve him and you all the days of my life. This is what I endeavored to do throughout my life, to serve God and my people. Who am I? Yes. And my centerpiece is a Bible and a teacup.
Wonderful. Thank you. Go get your picture taken. Okay, could I just have my Essential students stand one more time? Let's give them a big, loud round of applause. They did a great job. I'm so proud of you guys. You guys did a wonderful job presenting your papers, and your costumes look fantastic. So we are going to have a 10-minute intermission. We will begin promptly at 7:40. No, that'd be an hour intermission. Sorry. No. That would be 6:57. So that's an odd time, but we're going to stick to that. So if you guys could be back in here to watch the rest of the Essential students go, Mrs. Yoder's class, we would love to have you all stay. Thank you for joining us this evening.
At this time, if everyone could find their way back to their seats, and if we can get Miss Yoder's class to come find their seats up in front. Miss Lohman's class is free to sit with their families at this point. I will say this, I have yet to be, my amazement will never cease in hearing these kids perform and present themselves as well as they do. And it's part of the reason why our family loves Classical Conversations. So the skills that they are developing and their ability to speak in front of a large crowd are skills that are going to be lifelong lessons that they will take on with them forever. At this time, we are going to start with Miss Yoder's class, so I'll hand it over.
All right, we are going to actually start with Lizzie Stadig. her character comes first. We made a little mistake on the program. Her character was born in 497.
A Byzantine empress. I was born in 497 AD in Constantinople, which was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire began in 330 and lasted until 1453. This empire was the longest lasting medieval power. It is known for its famous mosaics, wall paintings, icons, and sculptures. Aqueducts, amphitheaters, and hippodromes are some of its creative architecture. The biggest and most famous building is a church called the Hagia Sophia, which was built in 360. It had beautiful wall paintings and mosaics and was dedicated to the wisdom of God. I became empress of this massive empire. My early life, my marriage to the emperor, and my achievements show that I was an adept ruler of the Byzantine Empire. My early life was unique. My family owned a circus that performed in a hippodrome, which was a huge theater. My father was a skilled bear trainer. When my father died, I became an actress with my sister. I was a stunning actress and constantly traveled to many places. During my travels with my family, I heard about Christianity. I became a believer and gave up being an actress to become a humble wool spinner in Constantinople. One day, Justinian, who was heir to the throne of the Byzantine Empire, was passing through the capital in a royal procession. Parading through the city, he met me and fell in love. Little did I know, my life was about to change. The drastic change was my marriage to Emperor Justinian. After falling in love, Justinian quickly appointed me to be his mistress. But Justinian's aunt, who was empress, did not want us to get married because she would lose the throne. However, she died before anything could be done. Justinian and I were rightfully married in 525. When we were made emperor and empress in 527, our marriage became stronger. My marriage to Justinian was about to lead to wonderful things. I am remembered for my many achievements. My life with Justinian was successful as we ruled together. Justinian never made a decision without consulting me first. We built the dazzling church of Hagia Sophia with its marble pillars and spectacular murals. Tragically, it was burnt down during a revolt between two religious groups. Justinian was in danger and was told by his advisors to flee. But I advised him to stay and protect our empire, or it would be destroyed. So we stayed together and thankfully stopped the revolt. After the revolt was over, we rebuilt the Hagia Sophia, even bigger and more spectacular. My wisdom in ruling with my husband and my skill in rebuilding this famous church are among my many achievements. My early life, my marriage to Justinian, and my important achievements are what is most remembered about me. I grew up as a circus performer. By chance, I met the emperor. My life drastically changed. Without my guidance, the Byzantine Empire would have turned to ruins. Much of what we remember about this mighty and long-lasting empire is due to my reign. Who am I? Yes? Yes. And my centerpiece is the platter of fruit.
Okay, Lizzie was Empress Theodora. Next we have Ryan Yoder, and his character was born in 871.
What gives a man the title of great? I had an extraordinary childhood. I was born in 849 AD in Wessex, England, to King Ethelwulf and Queen Osburga. At 4 years of age, I visited Pope Leo IV in Rome. Because my father was the King of Wessex, I grew up in a palace. Since I had 4 older brothers, no one imagined I would ever be king. However, all my brothers, who tragically died in battle, left me the sole heir to their throne. Sadly, my mother also died when I was 8. I love reading and learning. Even though I grew up in royalty, I had a tragic childhood. I was known for defending England against the Vikings. When I was just 21, I was the victorious winner of the Battle of Ashdown. While my men and I were eating Christmas dinner, a guard rushed in and exclaimed breathlessly, "The Vikings are attacking." A myriad of men were murdered, but I managed to escape to the marshes for years. For years, I, who was hunted by the Vikings, was successful in invading capture. After I was crowned king, I defeated the great Viking leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington. Because I was merciful, I did not kill Guthrum, but invited him to convert to Christianity. Subsequently, Guthrum was baptized and became a member of the church. I renamed Guthrum Athelstan and gave him a portion of land to rule over, bringing peace to England. I spent many difficult years defending England against the naughty Norsemen, but because of my mercy, I ushered a new era of peace and prosperity. What heroic deeds bestowed on me my great name? I made fair laws, I built better ships, and made the first navy. I encouraged exploration to the north, south, east, and west. I tirelessly worked to unite the people of England. Under my rule, Christianity spread through Britain. Ingeniously, I also invented the candle clock, which is a candle with rings on it. As a candle melts down, one can tell how many hours have passed. England owes a great debt to me because of my skill, leadership, and determination. I suffered much loss in my childhood because of the tragic deaths of my mother and brothers. I was a renowned fighter and defender of my country. However, I could not have had the lasting impact on England if my brothers had not died. The death of my brothers led to my coronation. Then I was able to make fair laws, build the first English navy, and advance Christianity through Britain. Today, England is still known as one of the first Christian nations with fair laws, thanks to my rule. Who am I? David. Yes. And my centerpiece is a candle that I put rings on and a Bible.
Next, we have Ella Parker, and her character was born in 1098.
I had a vision, and I saw within the mystery of God, in the midst of the southern breezes, a wondrously beautiful image. It had a human form, and its countenance was of such beauty and radiance that I could have more easily gazed at the sun than at that face. This is the origin of life. My origin began in Bermersheim, Germany, where the roads were dusty and the trees stood tall. It was during the Middle Ages. My parents were noblemen who were not rich as others, but had 10 kids, including me. My parents gifted me to God in 1106. Some would say that I'm a tithe offering because I was the youngest of 10 children. I was placed in care by a woman named Jutta of Spanheim, a mother superior of the community of sisters. She taught me to read and write. We became wonderful friends. During my time in the monastery, I grew fond of art, music, poems, and nature. Monks helped me write a book about my visions. It was passed around different monasteries, and so started my fame across Europe. I entered the Benedictine cloister of Dissen-Bodenberg on November 1st, 1112, when I was 15 years old. Under Jutta's care, I became a Benedictine nun at 18. After Jutta's death, I became a superior for the community of sisters. It was uncommon for women to write and preach, but I pushed women's limits. And rights in the church. My fame brought more and more women to the monastery, and it was getting crowded. The men refused to make more room for my sisters. So I made a hard decision. During my leadership, I moved my sisters with their dowries to build a monastery near Mount of St. Rupert. This decision maddened the local nobility in the church. I had to stand my ground for the next 27 years. God gave us nature for a reason. I was a sickly child, and so I explored nature for medicine. I studied some leaves and roots to make remedies. I usually make blackberry bramble drink for colds, parsley elixir for a strong heart, and flaxseed compressors for burns. These 3 remedies were commonly used at the monastery. I tried to bring balance between physical and spiritual through my natural remedies. My love for God and my vision spilled over to music and art. I wrote 70 songs and I composed several operas based on my visions. The nuns and monks enjoy the opera of Order Virtutum, Order of the Virtues. It is still performed today. It brings praises to God and the struggle between good and evil. My art is also famous, like my music. I created mandalas using beautiful colors like lavender, yellow, orange, and blue. I would a picture of myself as a signature. As soon as I was able to speak, I started to have visions. I had 26 visions, and a monk volunteered to write them down. Later, it became a book called Book of Divine Works. My visions inspired my sermons. One of these visions landed me in a strange world. People threw evil men in a pit of spikes, worms, and smoke. Then the living light said to me, "The evil has done wrong and will be brought to justice. The spikes are for the merciless, the worms are for the people who brought inhumanity to others." I used this horrid sight as a sermon about giving mercy. When I was 80 years old, I was paralyzed. My paralysis did not stop me from continuing my work. I created my own language called lingua ignota. It means unconstructed language. Although I was ambitious, I knew that I had to set my monks for good. For I knew my time was coming for an end. My last leadership effort was giving 20 monks to 20 other monasteries. I died on September 17, 1179. I was remembered for my visions that inspired art, music, poetry, and women's rights in the church. I was ahead of my time, and I was referred as a Renaissance woman several centuries before the Renaissance. Who am I? Yes. And my centerpiece is the mandala with the candles and Bible.
Next, we have Finley Yoder. Her character was born in 1112.
I was born in 1122 in France. My father's name was William X, a large statesman man who is often quick to squabble. My mother was a Nor. I enjoyed riding horses. I was beautiful, impulsive, and senseless. But as I became older, I was known for my perseverance and political wisdom. I was married 2 times. I had 11 children. My life was adventurous and colorful. I died in 1204. Who am I? Eleanor of Aquitaine. And my thing is a little tiara.
Next, we have Jackson Yoder, who was born in 1146.
England's greatest knight. A true knight is fuller of bravery in the midst than in the beginning of danger. Philip Sidney. I was born into an era of political turmoil. Henry I, who had died in 1135, intended his son-in-law Geoffrey and daughter Matilda to be king and queen. However, the couple had rebelled against the king before he died because he had not signed over his castles and land to them fast enough. For this reason, the nobles did not trust the couple and hesitated to carry out the king's wishes. While Geoffrey and Matilda were busy annihilating rebellions in France, King Stephen, a cousin, took advantage of this opportunity and had himself crowned King of England. My father had served under King Stephen for several years and then decided to pledge allegiance to Empress Matilda. Realizing he had made a mistake, he called for a surrender of the castle he was in, but the king wisely did not trust him and asked for a hostage. My father gladly sacrificed me, his youngest son, to be hostage. We will be exploring how I overcame abandonment in childhood. Since I was the second son of my father who served Empress Matilda, I was given as a hostage to King Stephen to assure my father's cooperation in serving the king. However, he turned on King Stephen and fought for the Empress Matilda. In 1152, I was sentenced to death for my father's betrayal when I was only 5 years old. On the way to the gallows for my hanging, I asked the king for a ride in a catapult, which appeared to me as a massive swing. Impressed by my courage, the king instantly vowed, "No harm shall come to you, young man." After a few years with the king, I became a squire at age 8. I was renowned for my horsemanship. I could leap into the saddle in full chainmail without touching the stirrups. Ironically, I was a horrid student and considered a pig at the dinner table. The day I was dubbed knight, the French invaded Normandy. I was eager for battle and valiantly rushed forward. Stopping me, one of the older knights snapped, "Let the real knights go first." During the battle, my horse was killed by a spear to the neck. Even though I unseated many enemy cavalry, I did not grab a single horse as a trophy. Selflessly faithful, I served Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine for 15 years. I was wounded and taken captive while defending her against the enemy. The queen paid my ransom. When I was brought home, I became the military tutor to Queen Eleanor and Henry II's son, who was next in line for the throne of England. During my long knighthood, I showed awe-inspiring bravery and courage. During the time of the Crusades, I traveled to Jerusalem. I had valiantly promised Prince Henry, who was on his deathbed, that I would take his cloak to Jerusalem. So I sailed across the Mediterranean Sea to Greece. From Greece, I sailed to Cyprus and then to Jerusalem. As I was entering Jerusalem, I saw ditches full of bones from animals and people from a severe famine. Everywhere I looked, I beheld hungry people and thieves. I watched a man kill another over a few green lemons. Suddenly in the distance, I glimpsed the church of the Holy Sepulchre. I slowly ambled up the steps and placed the robe on the altar. During my trip to Jerusalem, I learned that a knight who serves himself is no knight at all, but a knight with humility and generosity is what makes a knight admirable. Because of the lessons I learned, my trips to Jerusalem was worth it. Even though I had a challenging childhood, I did not let that stop me from becoming a knight. I overcame my fears by becoming a courageous knight. During my trip to Jerusalem, I learned that a knight who is selfish cannot call himself a knight. Philippians 2:3-4 admonishes, "Do nothing for selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourself. Let each of you not look into his own interests, but into the interests of others." Because I learned the importance of selflessness and chivalry, I earned the title of England's greatest knight. Who am I? You. I wasn't talking to you. No. I'm William Marshall. And my centerpiece is the sword with a Bible.
All right, next up is Burke Yoder. His character was born in 1157.
I was a towering, strikingly handsome knight who was also an amateur poet, aspiring musician, and an accomplished scholar. I was born on September 8th, 1157, in Oxford, was the third son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Although I was well liked, there's a dark side filled with little or no allegiance, planning, or sense of responsibility. My life was filled with clashes with my father and brothers, and cruelly punished the uprising in my French lands with fierce aggression. Nicknamed Coeur de Lion because of my battleground exploits, I only lived in England 6 months of the 10 years I was king, and didn't speak any English. While looking for a prime location to attack in the French countryside in 1199, I was surprisingly struck by an arrow. Despite the fact that it was a minor wound, I met my death when it became infected. I was 41. Although I was thoughtless and capable of great cruelty, I was still adored by many. Who am I? Over there. Yeah. So my piece is a crown and a shield with 3 lions on it.
All right, next up is Wesley Clare Novotny, who was born in 1451.
United Faith. Growing up as a Spanish princess sounds spectacular, but really it was full of loneliness, grief, and distrust. I was born in 1451, during a time when Spain was divided into 4 kingdoms: Castile, Aragon, Granada, and Navarre. Unfortunately, my father, King Juan II, died when I was only 3 years old. My mother's grief was so intense that she never recovered mentally. When my father died, my half-brother Henry became king and sent my younger brother Alfonso and I away. We were sent away to keep us out of the way. We lived in a remote castle that was part of a monastery, where priests taught us and Catholic Mass was part of our daily lives. At that time, I heard stories about wars, and nearby Muslims had burned cities and churches and killed Christians. My favorite story growing up was about Joan of Arc. She was a role model for me because I also felt strongly about defending my Christian faith. Although I lived in a remote area, King Henry did not forget about me entirely. He hoped to marry me off for his own political gain. I had to outsmart him and play along with the idea of his choosing my husband. But all the while, I was making plans of my own. I didn't wait to be found by a prince, but instead, I chose one. He was Ferdinand, Prince of Aragon. He was 17 while I was just 18. We had many things in common, like riding horses, playing chess, and practicing our Catholic faith. Yes, I had a difficult childhood, but I grew in strength, character, and faith, which helped me become a strong woman. As princess, passionate about my country and the future ahead, I felt ready to reign and rule with the right heart. Marrying Prince Ferdinand on October 18th, 1469 gave me the confidence and success I longed for. Just 5 years later, while Ferdinand was back in Aragon fighting a battle, when my brother the king died, I bravely accepted the role of queen while my unknowing husband was away. At my coronation, I put the flag of Castile in the priest's hands as a symbol, offering myself to the kingdom and to God. Then I was nobly led by a horseman holding a naked sword with the point in his hand so that it stood upright like a cross. This was a symbol of complete ruling authority that had not been carried out by a woman in over 200 years. When Ferdinand heard that I was given complete ruling authority, he was enraged because this limited his power. Over time, we forgave each other and chose to share power as king and queen. We issued a new coin with both of our faces on it and a new seal that had the phrase, "Tanto manto manto tanto," written above our thrones. This meant joint power written, to stand as high to stand. Together, my king and I were ready to rule and lead and protect Spain. My deep faith allowed me to reign and rule with the right heart and the right man at my side. The Spanish kingdom needed to be unified and have consistent religion. In 1481, the Muslim Turks from the Kingdom of Granada invaded Castilian territory, which threatened this unity. We needed to prepare for war. In 1492, we were victorious. Granada surrendered, which allowed for a time of peace. This was a golden age for Spain.
With the war over, there was extra money that could go into new projects, and a man named Christopher Columbus came to us for help at this time. He was interested in finding a new route to Asia. We gave him support and a letter of safe conduct, but instead of finding a new route to Asia, he discovered the Americas. It was important to me that any opportunity to convert others to Christianity was of utmost importance. The settlers in these new lands gave Spain the opportunity to share our precious faith. Unfortunately for me, I died in 1504, less than 12 years after Columbus discovered America. Ferdinand lived until 1516. We were buried in Granada, the kingdom we fought so hard to bring into the Catholic faith. Ferdinand and I ended our lives having resolutely worked to fulfill our royal and moral responsibilities. We earnestly cared for the souls of our subjects and reverently brought Spain together under a united faith. Who am I? Yes. Yes. Thank you. And my centerpiece is the doll on the horse.
Our next person up is John Willis Barron, whose character was born in 1564.
Sure. I was born into a vastly different world than the one I left behind. I had an educationally rich childhood and made many scientific discoveries and instruments. The modern world is still impacted by my discoveries. I grew up during Europe's Renaissance period. I was born February 15th, 1564 in Pisa, Italy. My father was a well-known musician who wrote books about music theory and mathematics. My father did not like close-minded people, especially ones in places of authority. This influenced me to be a versatile thinker and to question commonly accepted beliefs. When I was 11, I went to study at a monastery in Vallombrosa, which is south of Florence. When I was 15, I entered the monastery as a novice. However, my father wanted me to become a doctor. So, when I got an eye infection, I was treated in Florence and never returned to the monastery. After finishing my studies in Florence, I went to the University of Pisa to study medicine, like my father wanted, but I enjoyed mathematics more. In 1585, I left the university with no degree in any subject. 4 years later, I became the university's chair of mathematics. Because of my educationally rich upbringing, I went on to rethink many ideas of Aristotle and the Catholic Church. I made many discoveries in instruments. One instrument I used to help me in studying ballistics was the sector, which measured the angle of cannons. I was able to discover that the optimal angle to achieve long distance for a cannon was 45 degrees. My studies in acceleration also helped me my studies in ballistics. Next, my fascination became the newly invented telescope. The only known telescope in existence was too far away for me to study, so I made my own. It only took me 24 hours to create my first prototype, which used one convex lens and one concave lens. My design, using two different types of lenses, solved the problem of the image being upside down. With this telescope, I was able to study the planets and the stars more easily. I published many papers and books about the solar system that supported the Copernican theory, which states that all planets orbit the sun. At the time, the Catholic Church and students of Aristotle's theories believed everything revolved around the earth, which made it difficult for me to share my discoveries. I was persistent and developed a scientific method which led me to becoming known as the father of modern science. The modern world is still impacted by my numerous works and discoveries. Isaac Newton, who was born the same year I died, was greatly influenced by my work, and I used my findings as the foundation for his laws of motion. My scientific experiments provided evidence that supported Copernicus's heliocentric, sun-centered theories, which even the Catholic Church came to accept 20 years later, and is now a widely accepted truth. On the space mission Apollo 15, astronauts performed one of my experiments on the moon. They dropped a hammer and a feather from the same height, and they landed at the same time. This proved my theory that weight does not determine the rate at which an object falls. In 1989, NASA launched a space probe named after me to study Jupiter's 4 moons. I'd observed Jupiter's four moons myself for the first time in the 17th century. My work marks the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, which was centered around the belief in the power of human reason. I helped develop the scientific method and challenged the current beliefs about the universe through meticulous observation. My discoveries are now often taken for granted, but if it were not for me, we might still think we were the center of the universe. Who am I? Yes? Yeah. And my centerpiece is the telescope over there.
Next, we have Leland Barron, born in 1643.
I'm one of the most influential people in history. My work influenced many fields of science, including mathematics, astronomy, and physics. I am a brilliant and solitary man who sought careful understanding in every aspect of life. I had a lonely childhood. I was born on Christmas Day, 1642, 3 months after my father died. When I was 3 years old, my mother, Hannah, remarried. Her new husband, Barnabas Smith, was the rector of North Witham. He did not want me to be brought into his household. My mother agreed to the terms, and my mother and I were separated for 8 years. I grew up on my father's farm in Lincolnshire and became a very skilled craftsman. I made a working model windmill when I was 13, but could find no wind, so I used a mouse to power the sails. In 1661, at age 18, I began my studies at Cambridge University. During my time there, I began developing my theories about the nature of light and gravity. One day, I went to a fair in Cambridge and something sparkly caught my eye, a prism. Although it was considered a mere toy, I thought I could do some useful experiments with it. I bought the prism and began experimenting right away. I documented every discovery in mathematical language in one of my many notebooks. Many of the things I wrote in my notebooks made their way into my published works, including my most famous, called The Principia. This book contains my 3 laws of motion. Optics is another book I wrote, which contains all the information I discovered about light. My discoveries led to my improvement of the telescope. I made the first reflection telescope, which can magnify things many times more than Galileo's refraction telescope, by using curved mirrors instead of glass lenses. In my lifetime, I was regarded as a leading thinker, and to some, a demigod. Albert Einstein wrote about me, happy child of science. Nature to him was an open book whose letters he could read without effort. About myself, I'm quoted, I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have only been like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or prettier seashell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. Without me, Einstein's work would not have been possible. Einstein developed his theory of relativity when he was thinking about what would happen to matter in extreme conditions, like when matter travels at incredibly fast speeds approaching the speed of light. In addition, most of modern astronomy is based on my ideas. For example, my work with light helped with the creation of spectroscopy, which is figuring out the composition of stars, the light they emit. Without me, there would be no space missions and satellites. I'm one of the greatest scientists of all time. My most important work is probably The Principia, which laid down the groundwork for almost every scientist after me. I sought to know all that I could of the way the world works. I remark that a man may imagine things that are false, but can only understand things that are true. Who am I? You. Yeah. Correct. And my centerpiece is the prism.
For those of you who couldn't hear, Leland was Sir Isaac Newton. Jamarian Miller is next. His character was born in 1874.
Saved from the abyss. We are all worms, but I believe I am a glowworm. Although I was an outstanding politician, I had many ups and downs in my career. I was born on November 30th, 1874. My father was an English nobleman and my mother was an American Iroquois. Unfortunately, I had an unhappy relationship with my parents, but I had a devoted nanny. I hated school, especially math. In 1908, I married Clementine, whom I called Clemmy. As a politician, I had many successes and failures. Once, after a big loss in politics, I decided to take up painting. However, I got tired of painting and decided to volunteer as a soldier. Even as a soldier, I would paint on my breaks. Clemmy was my faithful supporter in all my ups and downs. I became the Prime Minister of England in 1940 and again in 1951. The second time, I was old and feeble. I am remembered for my encouraging speeches. I tenaciously stated, "If we can stand up to Hitler, all of Europe may be free. But if we fail, the whole world, including the United States and all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age." Even though I made lots of mistakes, my intrepid leadership saved my country and the history of the world. I died January 24, 1965. Even though I disliked school, I was the mastermind behind the Army tank. I became a respected leader during World War II. I asked the United States and Russia to join forces with us against Germany. Because of my bravery and tenacity, we defeated Hitler and saved the world from sliding into the dark abyss. Who am I? Yes. Yes. And my centerpiece is the paintbrush and the paint thing.
Next up is Grace Bondaruc, who was born in 1910.
Fulfillment of deeds. I was born on August 26, 1910 in Skopje, known today as Macedonia. The day after I was born, I was baptized into Roman Catholic faith. I had a sister named AJ and a brother named Lazar, who were both older than me. Nicola and Drana, known to me as my father and mother, who were Albanian, both were important to the lives of the town and our little family. Nicola, my father, owned part of a construction company and was a member of the town's council. Drana, my mother, loved to care for those in need. When she wasn't cooking or cleaning for our family, she was cooking and cleaning for the people in town. We weren't rich, but we lacked nothing. When I was young, I took my studies seriously. Besides Albanian, I also learned Serbo-Croatian. During my childhood, I suffered from malaria and whooping cough. Our family's life was shattered in pieces when our father died. He left on a brief political trip, and when he returned, he became extremely sick and died the next day. The law didn't give my mother any part of our father's business and properties, and my father's partners refused to share the land or the business. Without income, our family struggled. Eventually, my mother recovered from her grief and started an embroidery business. We soon could provide for our family, and remarkably were able to help others too. In my childhood, our religion was taken seriously. I helped in the church as well. As I helped the Pope, he sometimes gave me a magazine called Catholic Missions to read. It was filled with exciting stories and adventures and missionaries. I loved the stories about people traveling to faraway places to help the needy. I told my mother of my interest in becoming a missionary. She thought I was too young to make such a massive life decision. When I was 18, I told my mother that I still wanted to become a missionary, and not only a missionary, but a missionary nun. I didn't feel that it was my decision. I knew it was the will of God. He made the choice, I would say. My mother still was not convinced that I was ready. The thought of not seeing me ever again blurred her mind. My mother, hearing that I still desired to become a missionary nun, shut herself in her room and prayed for a whole day. Late in September 1928, my friends came to my house for a farewell party. It was a teary goodbye. My mother feared it would be the last time she was to see me, and sadly, that's what happened. I never saw them again. I traveled to Paris to the Loreto Order, where I was taught about nuns. I was eager to travel to India to begin working. Early in January 1929, I finally arrived in India. On May 24th, 1931, I took my first vow as a nun. I traveled to St. Mary's School and began teaching. Working in the school, I could rarely go outside. That's where I longed to be, at the slums, helping those people. Thankfully, after a year of praying, the Pope allowed for me to work in the slums. In 1948, I began working there as a teacher for the children. I began with a stick and drawing under a tree. Soon after, parents donated slates, chairs, and tables. I rewarded the children with a bar of soap. Staying clean in the slums was very important. My desire grew to open a home for the dying homeless people. Years later, I traveled to the officials of the city to ask for a building. Although after it opened, the Hindus complained that I was trying to convert them to my religion, but I like to say, I convert you to become a better Hindu or a better Buddhist or a Catholic or a Muslim. I believed all religions were speaking to the same God. For 35 years, I've served in India. By 1965, Pope Paul agreed to open around the world. My mother wrote me a letter. She told me she was terribly sick. Although I wanted to go, the government told me I wouldn't be able to come back. So for the sake of the poor, I did not go. My mother died in July 1972, and my sister died the summer after. My brother also sadly died in 1981, but thankfully has seen me receive the Nobel Peace Prize. This brought fame, although I didn't want any. Fame not only brought blessing, but it brought disgrace. For the blessings, people donated more for the organization, which was for the dying. The disgrace brought people accusing me of stealing money from others. In 1980s, my health began to fail. I had heart attacks and suffered with diseases such as malaria and pneumonia. Against doctors' orders, I pressed on. But sadly, life does come to an end. I departed from the earth on September 5th, 1997, at the age of 87. I fulfilled my life with good deeds and was now on my way to meet my Maker. Who am I? Emma. Yes, and my centerpiece is the one with the dictionary, the Bible, and a piece of cloth and a cross on top.
All right, and lastly, we have Everly Crummett, whose character was born in 1926.
I have been called one of the greatest monarchs in history. I was born on April 23rd, 1926. I was raised in Buckingham Palace with my little sister Margaret. When I was 14 years old, I met my third